Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. So we all have seen a TV show or movie where somebody needs to sneak out, or somebody needs to go, a kid needs to sneak out, a teenager needs to sneak out, and so they leave like a basketball under their blankets on their pillow with like some, I don't know, with pillows making it look like a body.
Right.
Has there ever been a situation for you, Jason, where you did something to that effect, where you tried to deceive somebody to pretend like you were sleeping, or that you were when you were actually somewhere else or doing something else?
I cannot remember doing the fake, like the Ferris Bueller, or if you're from a different generation, like Escape from Alcatraz, because it's the same thing there, more technology with Ferris, where you leave a body in a bed, or a fake body. I have
both true stories.
Right. Yeah, that's true. We'll talk later. But anyway, the dynamic of sneaking out, I have done, and I just bring it up because my parents, we moved into this house before I was a teenager, right when I was a teenager. And I don't think they intended to do this, but the window right in front of my room were these huge bushes that were, man, if you did not make that jump, you were hurting. I mean, it would scratch your skin up. And I think I only tried it one time. And, man, even with a good leap, it caught like the back of my legs. Man, it scratched them up. And so it was a natural deterrent. So to parents out there, I would say you need to do some planting of very gruesome things for the very reason of what we're talking about.
I want to teach a parenting class, which is all just preventive shrubbery.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Don't pay attention to your children. As long as you plant the right foliage, you will be okay.
That's right. That's
so
what we're looking for. Do you have a story like
I
that?
do have a kind of similar story, and it is. So I don't know about you, but I assume a good portion of our listenership struggles with the phenomenon of having their phone before they go to bed. Do you have a good habit or practice around that? Like looking at your phone before you go to bed,
No,
like putting it away?
I have a bad practice.
Yeah, I have a horrible practice. And I've tried at different points, like leave my phone in a different room, but then I always have my justifications, and eventually it never works out in the end. So for me, I remember this started at a very early age for me, like maybe around like 8 years old, and we did not have cell phones back then, or I did not have a cell phone back then, but what I did have was a portable DVD player, and I was a massive nerd, Jason, and I mean, like, when I say massive nerd, like, my whole personality was Harry Potter, and that was who Connor Bryant was, and so I got the the Goblet of Fire movie, and my family got it, and I stole it from our family DVD tower thing, which is so funny. You don't see those nowadays. Everyone used to have a DVD tower.
That's
and,
right.
Used to judge. That was the first thing I looked at when I went to people's houses, how big their DVD towers were, and I would compare my family, and we're better off than you. We have Ferris Bueller, special edition with commentary from. No, I'm just kidding. But I stole it from them, and I stole my brother's portable DVD player, and I would take it up to my room. And before this, I have no recollection of ever fighting sleep or ever trying to ever staying up and looking at a screen. But for several nights in a row, I'm like not ninth grade. I'm probably like 9 years old, like in fourth grade. I am staying up for like nights on end, rewatching this movie over and over again, just because I had to stare at the screen. And I have done that 1,000 times since. But it's so funny for me. I have this pivotal moment in my life where I remember I had really good sleep habits. I didn't do this horrible thing, and I have pretty much done it every night since then, unless I'm just completely exhausted and there's no cell phone reception wherever I happen to be. So that's my story.
So the reason we started with sharing those stories about our odd sleeping habits or not sleeping habits is because we're going to be referencing a story in the Old Testament today that kind of is the climatic point of that story. The text we're focusing on today is in response to a question from Johnathan Odle. Johnathan is a former student of mine and a guy that I love that guy. So he's asking about an event that occurred in 1 Samuel chapter 19. And so we want to process that today. We're going to kind of shift it in this way. We will process what amazes us and what perplexes us. And then after that, if there's anything that we feel is left over about his question, we'll come back and address that. But context here is David is in Saul's life. We're in, again, First Samuel 19, and we're going to begin in verse 9. And Saul has already felt the temptation and the sense of competition with David, but something pivotal happens in verse 9. It says, "But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning, but Michal, David's wife, warned him, 'If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed.' So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment, and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, 'He is ill.' Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, 'Bring him up to me in his bed, so that I may kill him.' But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was the same goat's hair." So the question that we're processing today from our listener is stated this way. David's wife puts an idol in David's bed and then lies to the guards, telling them that David is sick so that David won't be killed. This is no small idol. It is big enough that the guards thought it was David. Why did God allow or not condemn David for having a household idol, or Michal for lying? And then that raises a question, too, that's similar in the next chapter. Johnathan and David make a plan to lie to Saul in order to save David again, and this was clearly a premeditated lie. And so the question is, why is this not corrected, or even why does it not even come up? This idea, and I think we could find this in multiple places clearly throughout the Bible.
And our listener will say that later on. It seems that God allows sin. This is how our listener would phrase it. God allows sin in certain situations, but not others. And was very kind and would love to hear our thoughts on that. And so that is a very interesting jumping off place of there are times, right, where God or a prophet or Jesus or somebody will say, what you're doing is bad, stop it. And there are other times where it's like, man, there is remarkable silence on this. And so how do you process, especially something like this? This seems to, this is a big deal. Because I think when I'd read it, maybe the last time I read it, I didn't pick up on how big a deal the fact that it is an idol is, and what that says about Saul's household, and what that says about even David. And so how do you process when there's not this how do you process when it seems like how do you process when it seems like God should be jumping into the story here to correct, but it doesn't happen?
Yeah, that's really good. I was hoping you go first so I'd have an answer.
You told me you had an answer. I wasn't gonna hear it until we recorded.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I was joking, I think. But let's say I did have an answer. What would that sound like? So the way I think about this is, number one, here's my bias. My bias is God is good. My bias is God is love, and everything that love is. So that would include being just and merciful, which in human hands, that feels almost contradictory. How are you just and merciful? And so there's a complexity there that even when I try to be unbiased, I still steer. So I'm just owning that I'm always looking for, how's God the good guy in the story, So I'm open to criticism regarding that. So the other part is, if I'm talking to someone and I realize they are much more intelligent than I am, and this happens sadly frequently, it doesn't mean I have to drop out of the conversation. And especially if it's in some area that they have enormous education or experience in and I have very little, I will tend to defer. Yeah, it's just natural. I think most people would. And it doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it does mean that they probably have a wider breadth than the article I read, on BuzzFeed. So
well, if you saw a video on TikTok on it, then it would be that would equate to whatever PhD or whatever.
That's exactly right. I think I'm 15 TikToks away from my master's degree in this subject. But anyway,
so I was listening to a podcast the other day where it talked about like this crazy doctor in the 1900s that he didn't finish his bachelor's and went on to like a 3-month course to get his doctorate or whatever for medicine. And I thought, man, I would have loved to be I would have loved to be an academic in the 1900s. Can you imagine it's a 3-month course for like
Yeah.
the highest level of your field?
And
So anyways,
a lot of it was probably trial and error. Like, ooh, that guy didn't make it.
I think most of it was air. I
Yeah.
think most of it was like, no, I think this lead's going to work out one day. So anyways, you were talking about, let me redirect you. You were talking about when you're talking to somebody who has more expert in a field and you feel this need to defer often.
Right, exactly. So when I'm trying to determine why did God do or not do something, I have to acknowledge if you believe the God of the Bible and that he's all-knowing and all-seeing and outside of time and has purposes that we couldn't imagine, that's a factor. That's a factor. And I see it in Jesus. Why is Jesus not correcting the sin in the world? I mean, if you really walk with Jesus, just, be over his shoulder in the Gospels, and we've covered this so much in Amazed and Perplexed, that it's like, why are you not correcting the racism, the sexism, the oppression?
Yeah, and that's so much more jarring because it's like literally God is jumping off the page into the story,
Yeah.
and you don't see the correction. Whereas as here, there's also, it's a reporting of what happened, right? It's
Right.
it's a reporting of it's not directly, God is in the story, right? But God is not the active physical character in this story here.
That's right. And the real impact on that is there's no perfect person in this story. Whereas with Jesus, there's a perfect person in the story. And then you're watching, how does perfection, because this is the question, I think, how does perfection deal with imperfection? And this question is not simply academic, because it applies to, how is God working with me right now? Mm-hmm. Because I don't own an idol, because you've got two issues that our reader brings up, or our listener brings up. And one issue is, why do they have idols at all? Mm-hmm. Saul is supposed to be a man of God, and David is married to Michal at this point, and he's a man of God, a man after God's own heart. And yet, why is there an idol here in the first place? And then number two, this lying that no one corrects. And I think it's a great question. Both, okay, can we get some sense of it? But also, how does God deal with my lying? How does God deal with my idol worship?
Yeah.
And so that frames it for me in that regard. And I haven't answered anything yet, I understand, but I'm just framing that question.
And I would even maybe put a little bit more meat on the bone, because so you get in the situation here where it's like it's David's going to die if this doesn't happen. Now you could maybe like find something else that wasn't an idol. Maybe it was so bang that it was just that closest thing, and and so she had the idol, so that's not the issue. So I think you have two elements at play here. If David does not run away, if there's not this lie, if there's not this hiding, then David will be killed, and that's bad. Being killed is bad. Being murdered is bad. But then you get to the Old Testament. But then you get to the New Testament, and you have Jesus saying things that are pretty radically pacifist, and turning the other cheek to your enemy, and not striking out. And even himself, allowing himself to be arrested, and allowing himself all these different things. And so, how do we process? Because I would lie. So you get to the big questions of people who hid Jews in Nazi Germany. I think unquestionably fantastic thing. Do it 100 times. Lie as much as you can to the Nazis about where the Jewish people you are hiding. But when it comes to ourselves, or when it comes to our own personal, nobody else is in trouble but ourselves. It would seem to me that Jesus would advocate for nonviolence or but then Jesus is very shrewd sometimes. So I don't know. There's a lot going into this conversation.
You know what you just said about him advocating pacifist mode, and he did. And if you're confused about, well, wait a minute, he turned the table, and I think people hold the view that he's beating people. Number one time. Number two, he's not beating people. He's driving animals with the whip, because sometimes you just get this picture like he's just insane. Mm-hmm. He's very controlled. It was a premeditated action, and he's proving a point. But the vast majority of everything he does is very pacifistic. And the irony to that, and it didn't pop in my head till you were talking, is that if somebody said, hey, you need to be, to a Jewish man at Jesus' time, you need to be a leader, like David was a leader. David murdered people. I mean, not just in combat. There were people that were already captured that he murdered. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting how, and the whole point I'm referencing that again is the idea of this huge shift in expectation. God sets the whole Old Testament about conquering, and either you're conquering land or you're trying to get out from being conquered. That's pretty much the story of the vast majority of the Old Testament. And of course, they were oppressed, the people in Jesus' time. So that was such a shift in expectation. And that's what this story is back in 1 Samuel. It's a shift in expectation because, like, number one, they shouldn't have had an idol. And why shouldn't they? Well, because they had the law. And the law said no other gods and no idol. This is not like some obscure passage we're running up against. And then this idea of being a person of honesty and integrity, something that we would say that's a function of justice or a way of applying justice. And so what's the reason why? Okay, so here's my first stab, and then I expect you to make this look good after I get done, Connor. Okay, so
I'm ready.
You're ready. So then you'll have the real right answer. Okay, there is a fallacy of believing that when God is in somebody's life, the way he makes you holy is he makes you completely moral. And until you're completely moral, he really can't work with you. And this is exposing yet one more time throughout the whole of the Old Testament, and we get glimpses of this in the New Testament. We just have a lot less narrative of the fact that God solely worked with people that were super flawed. I believe if David was tuned in to God in the way that even we are, maybe,
Mm-hmm. If you could see the full revelation of who Jesus is.
Yeah, and so that's a huge deficit to his view, and that's a great point. Like, he didn't even have the law necessarily handy to him, you know? Well, and if he had the law, I don't know if he had Genesis. He might have had Leviticus or aspects of that, but I don't know. Maybe we could find that out, but I don't know. But he certainly didn't have what we have. And so he is living in a way that, number one, was corollary with everyone else. So I'm just dealing with the lying part right now, and then I'll get to the idol part in just a second. But the key here isn't so much what David did; it's how God lives with His people and their sin. Mm-hmm. And so I guess it does apply to the idol dynamic. I mean, how many idols do I presently possess? And I'm just going to own. I idolize football. I love watching the NFL, and I will be in church about to preach, and I think to myself, just full candor here, I'll think to myself, I need to hurry up because I really want to get back for the noon game. I have those thoughts.
That's completely unreasonable.
Yeah.
I just watch soccer during church. So.
During church, that's good. If I could just figure out a way to do that. But anyway, I have idols all over. Now, when you ask me, Jason, should you? I would say no. I may even be taking action against. But in the middle of a life and death situation, I don't know the corollary to using my idol to support my life, mm-hmm. but I would. And the thing is, I think there's a fallacy that, well, God wouldn't work with you if you're connected with some sin. And I'm like, God only works with us when we're connected with sin. In other words, mm-hmm. if he was waiting for us to be perfect, and see, we think the physical idol is so much worse than the fact that I'm materialistic or I'm a glutton or I'm a whatever, I love, looking at the opposite sex or whatever it is that we idolize. And we're like, no, the physical idol in many cases probably had less of a hold on them than they did on us. Now, not in all cases. Mm-hmm. In some cases, that idols really consumed, especially when they were under stress. But this is the nature of how a perfect God works with actual human beings, is he doesn't make them clean up everything before he works with them. Yeah. And his correction is usually, and maybe this is a whole second point, it's usually very slow.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think for me, the very convicting aspect is our idea usually of what that big sin would be, or that big idol, that unapproachable thing, is usually God doesn't feel the same way about those things. For me, like, I love you, Jason. I love doing this. But if you went out and murdered somebody, I would probably be like, well, I can still talk to Jason. But I probably need to stop working with Jason. I probably am going to put a pause to the podcast, or, So, that's
the line you're drawing.
Murder. Okay. Two murders. No, but even to that extreme, we all have that line for what we think. And usually that line is just past where we would go, where it's like, okay, God will work with me up to this point, but man, anything past that, and like that just seems like too much. And I think your point is so important about what we think is a bigger idol and what we think are bigger problems. And I think honestly, in the Old Testament, there's plenty of evidence that the problem with the idols, it's not the fact that they were just stone. It's also what they represented and what and how it played out in their life. But what you said is so important about how God works with people. And I think I talked about that in our kind of like coming back episode after your sabbatical. When you look at the Old Testament and you see the progression of God's people, it just becomes so abundant how scandalously patient God is. How scandalously patient he is, not just with individuals, which he absolutely is, but with his people as a whole. And so that's how we get to the point where, like I talked a little bit before about how Abraham is like, hey, not sacrificing children, that's a big deal. That's good. That's some fantastic progress. And even when you get to the point of David, you get to hear, okay, what would even Christian nations 500 years ago, you have a deranged king, and you are the next in line to inherit that throne. What did 99.9% of people do in that situation who find themselves as heir to the throne with a crazy king? You kill him. You kill the king so that you can do the right thing, so you can have your place, so you can have your power. And I could even make a moral argument that it's bad that God just continues to allow Saul to be king when he is clearly so off course. We could have that conversation another day. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, you're
but I do think it's important. David is doing something here that is so completely different and foreign to the way things were done then, and even necessarily to how things are done now, because the way the world operates the way the world would operate until that point is, well, the natural thing is you kill him because he tried to kill you, and you would be a better king. And so why wouldn't you kill him? Like that would be what would be going on in my mind if I was David. Okay, Saul just tried to kill me. I will make a much better king than he is. Why wouldn't I kill him? And so in this story, God is making slow progress and saying, no, the way you get to better government, the way you get to be better people is not by making these making these massive moral sacrifices. I'm okay with taking the step here of you are not going to kill the person so you can have their power. That's the step that I want you to take in this moment, David.
Yeah, and so let's apply it to. I'll take this on me. I was raised in violence, okay, and so when somebody got mad, they were hitting you. So I marry my wife, and I'm committed not to hit her, and I am doing fabulous because I'm only exploding, like verbally, and it's like, oh wait, that's not of God either, but that's part of my growth, Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that it's okay that I exploded, but it also needs to be put in the proper perspective that that's progress.
I mean, that's more progress than basically however many thousands of years you think humans have existed. For your line, for your ancestors, there might be like 5 other generations in the past 200 generations that accomplished what you accomplished. And part of that is built on how the small steps that were taken through your great grandparents into your parents, and you eventually, being able to make that step and make that progress. And again, I could make the moral argument, man, that's so slow, but that's just the nature of what it is to work with humans, is that we don't make progress, and we don't make these massive jumps. We make these slow progresses, and then you look around and it's amazing. It's horrible the way women have been treated for all of history. And it's horrible that the way husbands have treated their wives, and it still happens. I don't want to pretend that it's not, but the fact that the expectation for a woman to not be hit is a massive, that's a complete change from how it was 50 years ago. And that's horrific. And that's the bare minimum now, which is good. But man, I think we often forget, I want to transition back to what you were talking about. But I think we often forget, of how long it takes to change, and how hard that process is. So I could keep going forward, but go ahead.
No, well, and so it's this idea, and I want to be super clear. I think David, and it's hard for us to get in this emotional state, but just you'd said this. I'm just going to return to this. So you're sitting there, and in theory, I don't know if it says this, but David's playing music. That's a whole purpose for his existence here, or his presence in Saul's room, his throne room, I suppose. And Saul throws a spear at him. So I don't know how many of our listeners have ever been like, this person tried to kill me. So the guy takes a shot at you. He's got a gun and takes a shot at you, and you escape, and he's coming after you. I think David, especially once we know the history that comes after this, that he will not lay a hand on Saul, even when Saul is vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I mean, imagine if you have in your life, and maybe some of our listeners do, a person that tried to kill you. Not somebody you don't like or somebody that's rude. Like, I still hold grudges over people who offended me, much less, pull out a spear and chuck it at me. And so this just happened, and so it is way dialing it down, not to kill him back, as it were. So that's a great point that you make. I do think that there are tons of stories that the Bible can't tell because the people didn't respond in the fullness of faith and purity. I want to be really clear on this.
That's good.
And we made this point in the New Testament study. It's like, wouldn't it be a beautiful story that the apostles are watching Jesus sleep and the storm is going on and they're just sitting there meditating because they know God will save them. Mm-hmm. And then they all go under, and now we have a story in the Bible of how people breathed underwater. We don't have that story because they didn't demonstrate that faith or whatever, because Jesus would have got them through it, And this is the point. God meets us where we are. But I do believe that David could have said, you know what? I'm just going to sit here and pray. And if Saul comes after me, what would we have a story about Saul at 2 feet chucking spears at him and they don't hit? It's like, what in the world just happened there? And I mean, I've seen live video of people shooting at people at 2 feet and not hitting them. So I'm like,
we see like this bed that cannot be moved from the room,
right,
and we see like you see a door that cannot be opened. I mean, like the endless creative ways that God would have come through in this, could have come through in this situation.
And that's the point. So I think I should aspire to, because to me, we don't do Amazed and Perplexed to say, wow, we figured this out. We do this to help us to see God anew, so that we can say, okay, what is God telling me today? For me, I have no interest in doing some kind of academic discussion. I'm saying, how does this actually apply to me today? And what it says to me is, God will work with whatever I give him. As long as I'm after his heart, and I will say again, I've said many times, David didn't have God's heart at all, ever. Maybe momentarily. He was after it. And that matters to God. And it allowed him to cover up a ton of David's sin. God's love covered over so much of David's sin that he was not held accountable for and was not punished for. But when it was to God's purposes, God would bring punishment, i.e. Bathsheba, or when he did the census, or any number of things that he does get punished for. But there is a ton of stuff he did not get punished for, and God was working with the reality of him. In other words, I was raised, man, situational ethics do not exist. In other words, you always do the same thing every time. And I'm like, that's great, except Jesus didn't. I mean, we have to own the fact that Jesus did things different all the time, And because it's Jesus, maybe we don't question it. But when we talk about, okay, I want to be Jesus in my world today, or I want Jesus to shine through me, that should it's going to look different all the time. Yeah. And Jesus in you is going to look different than Jesus in me.
And so you said something earlier. So when we look, David not killing Saul, David not retaliating, David not giving an eye for an eye in this situation is a glimpse of a part of Jesus. It's not the pure manifestation of the goodness and the purity of Christ, but it is a part of the goodness of God. Like there is the goodness of God is shining through in David in that moment. And so we see not the fullness, but we do see a part of it shining through. Then we get to the New Testament and we see the fullness of the goodness of God shining to a broken world and broken situations. And so we see how it keeps playing out in different ways, where we see when we see Jesus walking through the New Testament, we see how his pull, it's like a gravitational pull, and it's causing all these weird orbits, and it's causing all these weird anomalies and these things that we aren't sure why they happen, or why he's doing it in this specific way, or why he's acting in this specific way. The thing we have to believe, because we believe Jesus is God and he's good, is that the goodness of Jesus is not changing, but the way his goodness is encountering evil is warping and changing. And so I love this discussion, because I just think it's so massive and it's so good. Yeah, so I think it's really important that we remind ourselves when we're reading the Old Testament and the New Testament that the absence of the perfect figure in the story has a massive change on how that story would play out. And in the same way, in the New Testament, we see when the perfect figure encounters the world, when the perfect figure invades the world, that the different kinds of evil that he faces, or the different kind of hardships that he faces, are going to change how that love and that evil and that hardness come up and butt up against each other.
Yeah, that's really, really good. And I think that would bring me a lot more peace. I would experience more of the fruit of the Spirit of peace if I keep that in the forefront of my mind, is that in the application of that perfect person wants to live in me. That the Spirit of God that few possessed in the Old Testament, some did, and in this case, we're talking about Saul. He replaced the Spirit of God, which he initially put on Saul, allowing him to prophesy and do other things. That has been removed, and now he's got the spirit of. We haven't even brought up the spirit of, his spirit of evil that God sent. It's like, hold up, and that's a whole nother discussion. But it actually fits to the point of exactly what you're saying. This is what it looks like for a perfect God, not to eradicate evil, but to work with it for His purposes, and it's almost, how do I say this? I don't think I can think about it right. It's almost like if you're trying to, your house is flooded, and you're trying to clean it off, you're sponging it or vacuuming it or whatever, while it's still flooding. You would say, no, we have to stop the flooding, then we do the cleaning. And God's like, no, I'll do the cleaning while it's flooding. That's the whole wheat and the tares parable. Is like, no, I'm not going to remove it. I'm going to wait till the end. You're like, well, it'd be much easier, and that's the servant's point.
And the way we feel,
just remove it all.
Yeah, and the way we feel about it oftentimes is like, it's not that God's trying to remove it. It's like God's doorknob polishing over there, and I'm like, no, like the house is flooding, and you're polishing the doorknob.
You are missing the point, God.
In reality, we're not seeing the full picture. So I have I think a pretty good example. My daughter, she'll be 2 in December, which is crazy. I know, it's crazy. She's had sensory issues for most of her young life to this point, and so we have struggled mightily when it comes to food for her. Like, I mean, just battles upon battles. Like, I think there was a period of time where we were probably spending, I don't know, like 4 hours a day trying to feed her, because it was misery. And so we were able to get her some OT, and we started developing these new techniques. And so we're now at the point where she will sit with us at the table and most nights eat her meal. And that, if you could have told like 4 months ago, Connor and Hannah, we would have been like, perfect, fantastic. She's getting calories. She's eating, what we put in front of her for the most part. This isn't fantastic. This is a miracle. And you would be right. Like, that would be so exciting. But she's still chucking her fork at the ground, or even sometimes in our direction, which is incredibly bad. It's not bad to try to impale your, I know she's not trying to do that. It's not, it's bad. And as many times as many techniques and as consistent as we've been with it, she still has this will to keep going her own way. And there's a part of me that every time she chucks it to the floor, and we have to do this whole song and dance to help teach her how to not do this, that this is bad, I just go, this is the worst thing ever. She just keeps chucking things at the floor. This is so bad. But in the context of the growth that she has had, and even where she started and the problems that she had initially, it's like, man, I so quickly forget the progress that has come up before now. And all I can focus on is the unaddressed issue of the chucking of the fork. And I think we do that all the time with God. I think God takes us and pulls us and grows us into new areas, and pulls and grows other people in our lives into new areas. And it's amazing. And it brings us so much peace, and it brings us closer to Him. And there's the metaphorical, chucking of the fork, or not responding in the perfect way to somebody trying to kill you in David's situation. And even though we know it's like, oh, an almost 2-year-old is throwing their silver on the floor, big deal. Or, oh, David in a moment of panic decides that he's going to allow, himself to be lied about and an idol to be used for his escape. You're like, okay, big deal. Like, I imagine that might be David's conversation to us. Like, yeah, I was about to die. Make that decision in the moment. Make that decision in the moment when the king of your country decides he wants you dead. Make a decision to fully, live, maybe the mindset that we might think Jesus has. And that would be a very, very fair challenge.
Yeah, and this is the key, and this is the challenge, I think, depending on how you were raised. If you were raised that and the fact is, it doesn't match reality, but when you get together at your churches or in your communities and talk and say, no, you should just always do the right thing, and then you can't even process like Holocaust questions, would you have housed, Jewish people, because it's like, oh, we can't even think about this. There's just one right answer. Mm-hmm. And if that's what the Bible taught, there's just one right answer, then okay, well, we're going to figure this out. But the fact of the matter is, God works in reality that we are affected by evil, and He works with anybody that is willing to work with Him. Yeah. He starts with where you are. There's never a time when He's like, you got to get here. I mean, think about the examples of this. And once you start thinking about it, they're everywhere. Elisha heals Naaman, and Naaman says, hey, will you forgive me because I'm going to be bowing down to an idol for the rest of my life because of my job and my position? And Elisha's like, sure. Like, it's not, like, sure? Like, what in the world? No. I mean, it's just, that's crazy talk. Obviously idols have come up in Jacob's, was it Rachel, steals Laban's, her dad's household idols, and he's going to kill them all, and can't find it. I mean, idols are all over the place, and God works to it until the people's heart are totally devoted to the idols. By the time God's condemning idol worship in almost every setting in the Old Testament, they've been doing it a long time.
Yeah.
And they have totally forgotten him. So the existence of the idol wasn't really the main deal. And again, I'm not saying that it would be best to remove all idols. Let's be super clear on that. The point is God works with who you really are, not who you should be.
Yeah.
And that's true of every single person, including the apostles, including everybody.
Yeah. And I think it's important to just make the distinction, to make at least on my end, very clear that God is, in my opinion, the God revealed in Jesus Christ is always going to honor our attempts to save innocent life that is especially done by nonviolent means. So for me, I think that's one of those things that, like, it's not even a quibble for me of like, oh, somebody was rescuing, thousands of condemned Jews from the Holocaust. I'm like, yeah, no, those innocent lives that were nonviolently saved, I completely believe that the Father is excited and happy about that situation. God's not looking down and quibbling. Well, you could have done here, or you could have not told that fib. Or I even heard this crazy story of this guy. I was listening to this podcast, and it was this guy. He was in, I think he was in Belarus, and it was in the time of it was in the time of Nazi Germany, where they're rounding up a lot of the maybe it was Belarus or Budapest. I can't remember which one is one of the B European cities.
I wish I could help you. Yeah,
anyways,
sorry.
And it's this guy who he was just a random like Czech, or not Czech. He's some ambassador that was basically just decided, I'm going to go and save lives. And basically what he did, he was a confidence man. He would just walk up to Nazi officials and be like, those Jews are Swiss citizens, you can't take them. And he would just be so confident. He would just be so bold and confident in his lies that most of the time the Nazis would be like, oh, okay, you seem like you know what you're talking about. We're going to kill them, but you can take them now because they're your citizens. And I think to something like that, a story like that, yeah, we can be like, well, the moral, we shouldn't lie. And he had to practice his lying to get good at it and all this sort of, but I think unequivocally Jesus would be like, good job. And I don't know if this guy was a Christian or not, but good job. I think good job in specifically this scenario, good job, my faithful servant, because you protected innocence and you protected goodness and life, and you were a source.
I don't know what light this would shed on it, but I'd be interested to go back and listen to our podcast we did on Luke 16 of the parable of the shrewd manager, because you have a similar situation. And he's talking about, the parable's talking about him saving his own life. Mm-hmm. And yeah, maybe he cheated himself only, by taking out his wage, however you see that. And again, I can't even remember what we concluded or if there was a conclusion. But I do think this is Jesus sharing a story about somebody, and what one person could look at as dishonest, he's labeling as shrewd. And I think that's the point in all of our lives. Am I trying to see it from God's perspective, even if I think I already know? Because there are tons of things in history where people felt like, I know this is true. Things like slavery, that I know there was a contingent of people that wouldn't have stood up for like a master, abusing their slave. But they're like, well, it's just the world we live in. There are people that have slaves, even if I don't have slaves, Whereas today we'd be like, no, we have to eradicate that. Like if I knew there was somebody, I know there's obviously sex slavery is a huge issue, but I don't know I can support agencies, but I don't know where that is, But if I did, if you told me, hey, Jason, that lady is being, especially if they're a minor, I would take risk there, you know what I mean? But I don't. But there was a time in our culture where people just like me were like, well, it's just the way of the world, and who am I to stop that? Now, I think they should have made a better decision, but were they saved? Or specifically, were they lost because they didn't die eradicating slavery, And this is the thing is, this is going on right now. There are injustices going on right now that I'm clueless as to how to stop, and even if I should, whereas 20 years or 100 years from now, they will judge me on that. And I could look forward if I knew what they did, and I could judge them on that. This is the point is God sees the heart of the person within the reality of their life context, and he says, are you willing to work with me on this? And that to me is the takeaway. Like, I could look at this, and I think it's reasonable to look at this and say, wait, we have idol worship and lying going on here, and I don't deny that. And I think God would say, you could do better, But you could also look at it as, look at God's compassion and his mercy and the fact he's taking David from where he is. Then I say, look at God's compassion for Jason. Look at. I rarely talk about myself in third person, but it's that idea of all my sinfulness, all the better choices I could be making, and God's like, yeah, are you with me? Let's go.
Yeah, man, I love this conversation, and I think it's so important, and I think it's a very important reminder that you brought out that there are real things today that we should be able to see, or things that we see that we don't think are as big a deal, or that we don't take as much action as future versions of Amazed and Perplexed, or Connor and Jason might see and go, how could they not have done that? And obviously, like, when somebody points out something horrific to me, I want to help. Like, I want to donate to agencies. I want to be a part of the problem of righting injustice. But the almost certainty is that as God slowly marches us forward and crafts us more into the image of Christ, and as God marches us forward, and as he makes us more into the image of who we were always intended to be, we become more and more aware of how far away we are. We become more and more aware of how much we don't line up, how much we haven't done. And so where before, I hope for David's sake that he recognized in this moment, man, I didn't give an eye for an eye. I did something good here. My hope would be in my situation when if I'm in David's place here, that I would be able to rejoice in the moment for not repaying evil with evil and doing something and breaking a cycle here. But then down the road being like, okay, but I could have done this better, and I could do this better in the future, and I can work on this. And I think that would be my encouragement through this episode. One, yes, could David have done things differently? Probably. Is there a more perfect way to do things that God would have preferred? Absolutely. But I also don't think God's like, well, you only got 50% credit. So, I think God would want David to be pleased. Hey, like you made progress. You were committed to goodness in a new way, not in the full way that I want you to be, but you were committed to goodness in a new and special way. And so that would be my encouragement for myself, honestly. Is one, don't be satisfied with not just killing your enemy, but also don't be necessarily down on yourself or down on God because he's slowly taking these steps beside you.
Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for the questions. And I would say keep them coming, not because we have the answers, but it gives us the opportunity to stretch, and iron sharpening iron, and that whole thing, because that's what we want from this podcast, is people to hear it and ask better questions and think and ask God, hey, make this clearer for me, because the word is living and active, and we want to constantly be surprised by the amazing and perplexing things that come up. Grace, peace, and love.